San Diego, California, September the 28th, 1977, 7:45 p.m. A group attending a 3-day conference of the International Association of Chiefs of Police travels by police bus to an evening session.
Hey, all you guys, sit down right now. Hey! Sit down and keep your ass down, don't get up again.
What the hell do you guys want anyway? You got what we want. You.
The seizure of that bus was the beginning of a police training exercise. The terrorists were played by members of the San Diego police. It's an example of a growing worldwide effort by police and the military to cope with the newest and most dramatic form of terrorism, the seizing of hostages. Other forms of terrorism, kidnapping, bombing, assassination, are easier to execute and hence more frequent. But the holding of completely random victims as pawns in a deadly game of blackmail goes farther towards accomplishing a major terrorist goal: public attention. Terrorist groups are small, relatively powerless, unable to wage war for their objectives. So they fight miniature battles aimed at manipulating public opinion. There are several kinds of terrorists: criminals, psychopaths, and political terrorists out to change the world, or at least part of it. Tonight, we will examine those hostages taken by political terrorists and what has happened to them. Those people who have been there and survived. Much of modern terrorism has its roots here in the Middle East, nourished by a fertile soil of war, frustration, and hatred. It began in 1948, when Israel declared its statehood in what had been Palestine. The surrounding Arab countries immediately attacked the new Jewish state. Israel won that war. In the process, almost 1 million Palestinians fled or were forced out to live in refugee camps, like this one in today's Lebanon. The problem of the Palestinian refugees was like a time bomb. It exploded when the next generation of Palestinians, many of them born in the camps, spawned a small number of fanatics bent on avenging the fate of their parents. The Palestinian terrorists had political goals: to recover their homeland in what was now Israel. Their most spectacular act ended at an abandoned World War II airstrip. In 3 days, in September 1970, 3 airliners were hijacked by one terrorist group and brought to Dawson Field in the Jordanian desert. This was the theatrical introduction of the new terrorist tactic: seizing hostages, making political demands, holding hostages' lives in the balance. The last of the 3 planes to be hijacked was a BOAC VC-10. The hijacking of Captain Goulbourne's plane brought the number of hostages on the desert to 600. In exchange for their lives, the hijackers demanded the release of 7 Arab terrorists being held in West Germany, Switzerland, and England. During a news conference in Amman, the capital of Jordan, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, proudly claimed credit for the coordinated actions. Spokesman Bassam Abu Sharif.
The world public opinion did not help us in a single inch since 22 years. So we don't care about the public opinion. We know, we respect those people who try to understand our cause. Nevertheless, we know exactly that through such operations, although it is a severe entry to their minds, but nevertheless, it is an entry that would create the big question, why?
That was Sharif in Amman. This is Sharif in his Beirut headquarters 7 years later, bearing the scars of an exploding letter bomb.
The net result at that time was a clear entry to the world public opinion. Although it was shocking, but it was an entry nevertheless. And the world public opinion had to ask at least the question, who are these? Why are they doing that?
The answer was clearly to capture not so much passengers as the world's press, the inescapable hostage of all terrorist acts. On September the 11th, all of the hostages were bussed by the terrorists to be held in Amman. Half an hour later, the three now empty planes were blown up. With the hostages scattered around Amman, the complicated negotiations with the four countries continued. Throughout the next 18 days, groups of hostages were released sporadically, at times and in ways that made no apparent sense. And then, with 54 hostages still in PFLP hands, civil war broke out in Jordan. King Hussein's army attacked Palestinian guerrillas, including the PFLP. The Palestinian guerrillas called that month Black September. Hostages caught in the crossfire called it hell. A terrorist operation begun with almost military precision ended in a shambles. Captain Goulbourne and his group were rescued from a Palestinian refugee camp by the Jordanian army. On September the 29th, 3 weeks and 2 days after it had begun, it was over. All of the hostages were freed, and the 7 Arab prisoners the PFLP had demanded were released from European jails. The sands of the Jordanian desert may one day cover the charred remains of the 3 airliners. But it is doubtful that all the damage was left behind on the desert. Dawson Field was a landmark, the real beginning of hostage-taking as a terrorist tactic. It did not, of course, win back Palestine from Israel. It did put the Palestinian cause on front pages throughout the world. That success was enough to inspire imitation by terrorist groups everywhere. Palestinian terrorists themselves used the tactic again in Europe, Asia, and Africa. A Palestinian from the Israeli-occupied West Bank explains.
The governments of the world stand behind Israel, give Israel everything, and we left and lost everything. So our boys, what you call terrorists, lost their minds, their patience. What they do? Suppose you yourself, instead of them, lost everything. What you will do?
What the Palestinian terrorists did was add the seizing of hostages to their other tactics in raids across Arab-Israeli borders. They had little hope of winning anything, even their constantly repeated demands for the release of prisoners. They conducted their missions, sometimes suicidal, out of sheer rage to hurt the Israeli state, to terrorize its people. Sometimes, as here at Ma'alot, on May the 15th, 1974, the prisoners of war were children. These Israeli youngsters were here then with their schoolmates, off on a field trip from their religious high school in nearby Safed. There were reports of Arab terrorists in the area. But the students, more than 100 of them and their adult escorts, settled down for the night here at the local school. Minutes before 5 the next morning, 3 armed Palestinians arrived at the school. As they broke into the school, 20 students and all but 2 of the adults jumped from second-story windows. The terrorists sent one of the 2 remaining adults out with their demands. They still held more than 80 children and a single teacher. They planted explosives in the school. With Israeli children in peril at the school, Israel's cabinet voted to meet the terrorist demands. The release of 20 prisoners from Israeli jails under a complicated procedure involving code words and flights to Syria. The terrorists warned them to hurry, or by 6 o'clock they'd have 85 dead bodies. When it became clear that the 6 o'clock deadline could not be met, the Israelis asked for an extension. The terrorists refused. At 5:27, believing they had no options left, Israeli troops attacked the school. One terrorist was killed trying to blow up the building. The other 2 turned on the children with automatic weapons and grenades. The last 2 terrorists were killed. In 12 minutes, it was over. 16 students were dead, 5 lay dying. Few escaped injury. The principal of the children's school, Shimon Ben Lulu.
I saw the whole thing. I saw the horrible results. Almost all my students were killed or wounded. Very few survived unharmed. Very few. And even they were walking around in a state of shock.
After this, all my life is broke. Because all night I'm afraid to sleep. I always think about this, and my best friend, my best girlfriend, were died in Malo too. So all night I'm afraid. I'm not that girl who was before.
I just see the Arabs in different point opinion, and before I thought about them like just everybody that like people, but now...
The children who died at Marlot were buried the next day. 10,000 mourners cried out Israel's outrage and grief. It was a case of rage producing rage, for children this time had become the unlucky frontline troops in the not-quite war that is terrorism. The military advisor to the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which claimed credit for Marlot, is Abu Firas.
From the results of this operation, we can say that it has accomplished a number of its political and military objectives. Therefore, we consider the Marlot operation a success.
2 years after Marlot, Palestinian terrorists pulled off what looked like the perfect hostage seizure. They hijacked an Air France jet which had originated in Tel Aviv and diverted it to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. In an operation that has since become legend, Israeli commandos flew 2,300 miles to rescue the hostages. The surprise attack succeeded, catching the terrorists and their protector, Uganda's Idi Amin, completely off guard. 3 hostages died in the attack. But when 104 returned safely to Israel the next day, that country exploded with joy. The assault and rescue spelled out a clear message to terrorists everywhere. No matter great distance, hostage takers were no longer safe from assault, nor hostages too far to be rescued.
The shooting took something around 10 minutes. And I didn't think it's Israelis. I didn't think at all what it can be. I was very frightening because when you hear a shooting, you're not thinking who it is. You're thinking about yourself, what it's going to be. And I didn't know this is Israeli. I just pray for myself.
A bullet hit me, and I can tell you that from that moment until the moment I found myself in the hospital in Kenya, my whole focus was on the struggle to survive. I had lost a lot of blood. The feeling of being freed or the other moments became completely unimportant. I knew only the struggle to survive. So I can't talk about the joy of being rescued, but only about the desire to survive.
When you are outside the story, I mean when you are not really an hostage, you can't feel really the main feelings that hostages has.
Nobody who didn't pass this experience cannot understand. I'm sure that somehow we are not the same. Of course, I'm happy that I'm alive, but it is experience that you can't forget. You can't forget.
It is no coincidence that political terrorism and its newest tactic, the seizing of hostages, is directed mostly against democratic countries. Democratic countries care about the individual, and hence the individual hostage. That makes them vulnerable to terrorist threats. And in democratic countries, the press is free, and hence not subject to the suppression of news about terrorist acts. Terrorists want the news of their acts to be reported widely. What happens then when a democratic country comes under prolonged terrorist attack, there are two basic possibilities. The government can respond with repression, suspending civil liberties in its attempt to stamp out terrorism, or it can take the more difficult path of combating terrorism and terrorists within the framework of law. Over the past 5 years particularly, West Germany has been faced with precisely this choice. How it has responded provides an important lesson for all democratic countries. As terrorist acts continued, the homes and offices of government officials sprouted all the accoutrements of siege: police with automatic weapons, barbed wire, armored vehicles. Private business and industry made similar arrangements to protect key executives. And then, last September, West German industrialist Hans Martin Schleyer was kidnapped in an ambush in Cologne that left 4 of his bodyguards dead. The kidnappers demanded the release from prison of 11 West German terrorists as the price for Schleyer's life. The search for the kidnappers brought an increase in roadblocks and security checkpoints. The look of West Germany changed. The tightest security for the average citizen was undoubtedly at West German airports. This is Frankfurt Airport, the largest on the European continent and one of the most secure. But one secure airport is not enough. A single weak spot is all the terrorist needs. For the West German government that had stalled for 38 days in the Schleyer kidnapping, that weak spot was Majorca in the Mediterranean. A Lufthansa plane was hijacked and flown finally into Mogadishu in Somalia. There, the pilot, who'd been murdered, was removed from the plane. The terrorist demands were virtually the same as those of the Schleyer kidnappers. But it was now 1977, 5 years after the disaster at the Munich Olympics, and West Germany was prepared. Dr. Hans-Joachim Vogel was West Germany's Minister of Justice, serving on his country's crisis committee. He had to deal with personal feelings as well. Dr. Vogel.
It's a feeling of strong animosity against terrorists which use man as items, as weapons, not as man. You became angry and you have the wish that these people shouldn't be any more alive. There was another feeling. You are now in a position to decide on the lives or on the deaths of 87 completely innocent people. What happens if you release 11 very dangerous criminals? These 11 prisoners had already murdered 13 people and made attempt of murder against 42. And you had to think about, if you give in this case, why you may resist in any other case. There have been still 50 more in our jails. How to answer the next demand? Or if they take hostages and they demand the retirement of the government, what then?
The decision was to assault the plane at Mogadishu, using an intense flash of light to blind the terrorists temporarily.
We got the information that the operation will start at midnight. Within seconds, door open, flashlight used, and already 2 or 3 minutes later it was said through the phone, first passengers leaving the aircraft, no more passengers leaving the aircraft, shooting still goes on. Well, and 12 minutes later all was over, work is done, all saved. And it was incredible in the first moments that really all have been saved. It was a great feeling of easiness. It was very impressive.
2 of the 3 terrorists were killed in the assault. The third, a woman, was wounded. In West Germany, 3 of the 11 terrorists whose release had been demanded committed suicide in their prison cells. Finally, the body of Hans Martin Schleyer was found in the trunk of a car in France.
But it remains a rest of a feeling of guilt against the man killed. In this case, we have been happy enough. Only 2, but the word only doesn't match the situation. Mr. Schleyer and Mr. Schumann, the captain of the aircraft, and As you may imagine, it was a very difficult thing to write a letter of condolence to the widow and the sons. I have been in the daily contact with the eldest son of Mr. Schleyer, and the only way out was to confess my situation, and our President of the Republic made a very good obituary speech and said to the family, forgive us for what we had to do.
It is the final irony of hostage cases that the terrorists are able to force the awful decision of which lives to spare onto the governments that are their real targets. And worse, when a government resists terrorist demands, as is happening more and more these days, the terrorists then produce their ultimate perversion of the truth. They blame the government for the murders they themselves commit. Julie and Zvonko Busick, husband and wife, are today serving time in separate federal penitentiaries. They are there convicted of hijacking an airliner with 93 people on board. The terrorist action which led them to prison began here at New York's LaGuardia Airport on September the 10th, 1976. The target for the Busicks and their 3 accomplices was a TWA Boeing 727 bound for Chicago. That flight, like this one, began routinely, but it ended in Paris, France, after forced stops in Montreal, Newfoundland, and Iceland. To convince the authorities they were real, Zvonko Busick had the pilot radio New York, but a bomb identical to those on the plane had been left in a subway locker. Zvonko Busick's wife, Julie, was an American, but he and his 3 male accomplices were Croatian nationalists. Their cause, independence from Yugoslavia for Croatia. Busick demanded that propaganda leaflets be dropped over New York and 4 other cities, that a message be printed in major newspapers. All of the demands were met. But Busick, holding the plane in Paris, wanted proof. As in many hostage cases, some of the hostages found themselves angry with the authorities for resisting the terrorist demands.
Speaking for the French government, I have asked to let you know that you have 3 alternatives. 1, to be killed on the spot. 2, to surrender to the Yugoslavian authorities. Or 3, be surrendered to the American authorities. And this is Captain Terry speaking. You are asking that this whole ship full of innocent individuals should be killed to prove that you can take a stand against terrorists. Tell us, please, what we are being killed for. I want to know what it is that these people have asked to be done that civilization cannot do. This is Captain Terry, out.
What no one on the plane knew until later was that a New York policeman had been killed by Zvonko Busick's bomb. After 19 hours on the ground in Paris, the terrorists surrendered, revealing that the bombs on board the plane had been fakes. Pilot Richard Carey and the terrorists returned to New York.
I was glad they were reasonable. We were respectful of one another. One of the hijackers, the female, was extremely solicitous to everyone on board. I might say that they conducted themselves gentlemanly, but gentlemen were dealing with terrorists. They were gentlemen terrorists.
The next day, Officer Brian Murray was buried with full police honors. Zvonko and Julie Busick were sentenced to life imprisonment. They are serving their sentences at separate federal prisons. They have their own views of themselves and what they did.
I think it is extremely unjust to call me or the group which was involved in this incident terrorists. The fear the people had to go through was just some kind of a necessity.
I knew that my husband had decided to undertake this action. I knew that he could not be dissuaded, and I knew and sympathized with his reasons. And he felt that he had no other choice. as far as I was concerned, I had to choose then whether I were to go or to stay at home. And the way things turned out, I think that I was a positive influence.
I took them along with me because I needed them. I couldn't execute the whole thing with by myself.
Of course I have trouble justifying it, of course. You know, I can't say, well, no, it's okay to take away people's freedom if it's for a good cause. And that's what a lot of people say. It's not right, but how can I explain it? If it's a question of going through temporary suffering, an innocent person going through temporary suffering in order to help others establish some kind of permanent liberty or permanent situation of human rights, then I think that people could understand it more. And I think a lot of the passengers did understand it once they got to know a little bit more about the problem, although I'm sure they didn't excuse it.
I gave many speeches and Croatian banquets and anti-Yugoslav demonstrations. And for these activities, I was a target.
2 attempts were made on my husband's life while I was with him. Others were made when I was not with him.
Well, I knew I was going to end in jail. And I knew in jail is quite safe. I wasn't safe outside. And I knew when I come to the American court, I would try to explain myself.
I think we were very, very idealistic, and I think we put a lot more faith in people than they showed us that they had or that they deserved.
I was concerned by constructing the bomb to construct it the most simple way.
They didn't follow my husband's instructions about how to detonate it. He gave them instructions, he told them exactly what was inside, and they didn't do any of it. They just went ahead and did things the way they thought.
I had such a feeling. If my grandmother would find it, it wouldn't hurt her.
So of course, if he hadn't put the bomb there, of course nobody would have been hurt. That's true. He carries a certain responsibility, but I don't think he carries all of the responsibility.
I perfectly know that this is not correct and right thing to do, especially towards the passengers.
Well, at the end, when I knew that the whole thing was over, I think it was the most frightening part for me, because when we were brought into the building, they had 3 people in there who spoke what I thought at the time was Serbian. Because Serbian is similar to Croatian, but it's not that similar, and I knew it wasn't Croatian. And I thought that they were sending us back to Yugoslavia. And this is the first time in my life I've ever been hysterical. I've never been hysterical in my life except this one time, because I couldn't understand how they could do it, because none of us were Yugoslav citizens. And I knew that they would kill my husband immediately. And I didn't know what they would do with me. But I just completely broke down. And they had to carry me screaming from the room, really. I was yelling for the pilot. I was saying, "Help, Dick, help us. They're taking us to Yugoslavia," you know. That was the worst part of the whole thing, I think.
On May 23rd, 1977, Holland faced a hostage seizure. But this time it was psychiatrists, not soldiers, who first carried the burden of trying to free the hostages. For the hostages, there were 18 days of helplessness, with their fate in others' hands.
I was sleeping, and there were 2 girls sitting with me in that same carriage. And one of the girls started to scream. I looked beside me and I saw somebody holding a pistol. Then we heard Max saying through the train system that everybody who was going to escape would get a bullet in his chest. Then we realized that it really was a capture, and we sat very quiet. Then he came back and he separated the people. mothers with children could leave the train. Nervous people and older people could leave the train because they wanted about 50 people to hold for the capture.
9 young South Moluccans, led by a man named Max, took command of the 54 remaining hostages. For the citizens of quiet Holland, it was a chilling case of déjà vu. For almost exactly the same thing had happened just 18 months earlier on the same railway line. Then, too, it had been South Moluccans, and they had held their hostages for 12 bitterly cold December days. Only a handful of the 40,000 South Moluccans in Holland have turned to terrorism. Those few have used terrorist acts to demand the independence of their ancestral islands in what was the Dutch East Indies and is now Indonesia. In the first train hijacking, the engineer was wounded during the takeover. He was later executed. The terrorists demanded a bus to the airport, 50 pair of handcuffs for the hostages they would take with them, and a plane to take them to an undisclosed destination. If they didn't get them, they warned, another hostage would be executed. The government stalled. The deadline passed. A hostage, Wintje Kroosweg.
The ultimatum was finished, and then they had to do a killing.
They did one, the second. The chosen victim, brought to the train door for execution, escaped in a rain of bullets. A young Dutch soldier was forced to take his place. They shot him and pushed him from the door. The next day, there was a new deadline and the threat of a new execution. Inside the frigid train, the terrorists told several men they would be next. Gerard Vaders.
They came up into the compartment and somebody went straight up to the place where I was sitting, but to my surprise he didn't choose me, but the man who was sitting next to me. And I think I will never forget the way he looked, astonished, pointing to himself, me, and then they let him away and he had to kneel down in the next compartment, and some time later we heard just one shot ringing out.
That turned out to be the last execution. Negotiations dragged on in the freezing weather. Then, after 12 days, and to everyone's surprise, the terrorists surrendered to South Moluccan mediators. All 7 received 14-year sentences. An official commission was appointed to study the South Moluccan grievances. And though the terrorists failed to achieve their immediate demands, they did succeed in informing the world of their cause. For some young South Moluccans, even that wasn't enough.
You can talk about the success after the right is done to our people.
Don't give up. Not to give up, I think. Because when they give up, we are still at the same place. Our parents told us about our land, the Moluccan, and we are still fighting for our freedom. And it is now 27 years.
Mr. Lumelessel, a former corporal in the Dutch colonial army, has seen 4 sons become terrorists.
Buat perasaan, saya punya perasaan saya.
My feeling.
Oh, saya mesti.
My motherland, my fatherland.
Saya mesti kembali. Saya mesti kembali. Saya tidak mau tinggal.
I must go back. I don't want to stay. No, I must go back. This is not my country. Here, I admit, is good, full of everything that's good.
Tidak senang. Karena saya sudah ditipu datang di sini.
But my heart is not happy because I was misled into coming here.
Mesti pulang. Saya mesti pulang di saya punya tanah air.
I must go back to my country.
Saya mesti pulang di saya punya tanah sendiri.
Pete Tooney and Susie Lumelessel each had a brother on that first train. For them, too, the second hijacked train 18 months later was a case of déjà vu. For each had a brother on this second train, too. The second train had barely screeched to a stop when 4 additional South Moluccans stormed into a primary school 20 miles south in Bovensmilde. They seized 105 children and their 5 teachers. This time the demands included not only a bus and a plane, but the release of 21 South Moluccan terrorists in prison, including the 7 convicted of the first train hijacking. Dr. Dick Mulder headed the crisis team that assembled here in an Army command bunker near Assen. As chief negotiator, Dr. Mulder brought his knowledge of human psychology to bear on the problem of understanding and evaluating terrorists who were total strangers. Communication was quickly established with the terrorists in the train and the school by telephone. Dr. Mulder.
I think the first period, 1 or 2 days mostly, is certainly the most dangerous because you have got to do with people who, from one side, the terrorists, have been working to this situation for quite a long time, process of making decisions, and finally it becomes the thing to do. And then they feel uncertain because they are uncertain. They feel anxious because you don't know what is going to come. How will be the reactions? Will anything go wrong?
Something did. There was illness among the children at the school. Dr. Mulder succeeded in persuading the terrorists to release them along with 1 teacher. Later, 2 pregnant women and a man with a heart condition were released from the train. But for the rest, the surreal days dragged on. For the people in the train, time seemed to have stopped. Far from the scene, in secret, Dutch Marines and other ground troops practiced for a possible assault with units of the Dutch Air Force. Negotiations were at a stalemate. The terrorists would not give up. The government would not give in. At daybreak, 6 Dutch Air Force starfighters dove at the train, their afterburners creating a havoc of noise.
Well, I thought this is the end. The whole train was shaking and it was like a war, and at the same time the soldiers started shooting at the train and through the windows and kept shouting, keep down, keep down. They threw smoke bombs, so at one moment I couldn't see anything at all. One South Moluccan boy came into our carriage and he started shooting at us. And then I saw my friend Marijke. She had a bullet hole here in her chest. The bullet went right through her chest and came out in the back. And I said to her, are you hurt? And I expected her to die very soon. But she survived. Miracle. And another girl started screaming, I'm dying, and that was Antje Mansour. And at the same time, the man, Rien van Barsel, had died too. Well, by that time, that crazy Moluccan got caught by the Dutch soldiers, and that was the end.
Only those 2 hostages died. 7 more were injured. 49 escaped unharmed. 2 Dutch Marines were injured. 6 South Moluccan terrorists were killed in the assault. 1 was wounded. In a simultaneous assault on the school at Bovensmilde, the 4 South Moluccan terrorists were captured and the 4 teachers released unharmed. The freed hostages who were not wounded were taken by bus to Groningen, where a team of psychiatrists and other doctors was prepared to counsel them. Holland is perhaps unique in its heavy reliance on psychiatry to understand both terrorists and their victims. Dr. Van Dyck.
We try to help these people by doing several things. One important thing that is to advise them and to give them the opportunity not to pent up their emotions, not just doing as if there has nothing passed, but trying to stimulate them to express the feeling, to make a clean breast of it, to talk it over and again and again, telling all details, and a very important thing that is to make them realize their feelings of aggression against the captors. Because what it is very astonishing to see every time when they come out, that are the friendly things they say about the captors. that is what we call the identification with the aggressors.
Once I asked him, what would you do, Max, if I would escape, and then he put his pistol at my head and pulled the trigger. But there was no bullet in it, of course. And he said, that's what I'm going to do if you escape. So don't make me doing it. I never knew if he really meant it or not. So we had long chats, and did these long chats. Well, the end of it, I felt like his friend, and I didn't look at him as a capture anymore, although the rifle was always in between.
The hijacking is over, but I think that was one of the first big lies in the whole affair, because when you have ever been a hostage, you'll be a hostage for the rest of your life.